Hi! For my final project for this class, I decided to go down two separate avenues and compare instances of systemic racism that we've learned about in class so far. The first one pertaining to the module where we learned about environmental justice and environmental racism, and then also when we focused on the most recent topic of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that have come about after George Floyd's murder last month. And we discussed in class how Black people have been more susceptible to coronavirus, and I just wanted to tie what we learned about that to police brutality. So my presentation is about why Black people in St. Louis can't breathe. So in the environmental racism category, this is more like why Black people are dying because of diseases that are literally causing them not to be able to breathe, whether that be asthma or poor air quality. And then this also is referring to the police brutality and referencing George Floyd in the video of his murder where he was yelling, "I can't breathe," while the cop was on his neck. So my final project is in the format of a Glogster, which is basically just an interactive infographic. So I just wanted to talk about all the information that's on here and hopefully be able to connect if it's not super clear on its own. First, in 1965, in a report published about the city by the governor, St. Louis was referred to as the city with a legacy of racial mistrust. So these instances of systemic racism are not new at all to the city, which is a reason why I chose St. Louis. I thought it was a really tangible option to choose a specific city rather than discussing it at the national level. And also, throughout the class, we discussed how sustainability efforts could be made or just progress in general. And we've all kind of decided that at the national level, it's really hard to expect for things to be done, successful progress. And I've said in my discussion posts that relating to sustainability, I think a lot can be done at the individual level. And I think this carries over into systemic racism. I said this in one of my previous posts that at the individual level, signing those change.org petitions and educating people is something that you can do on the individual level. But from the right of the city and those things, we have all kind of collectively acknowledged how successful city reform can be. And that's another reason why I wanted to look at St. Louis as a city rather than examining a person or a nation. So starting in 1857 with the Dred Scott case, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This is when a freed Black person wanted to sue his previous slave owners because he had moved to a freed state after finishing his slavery term, and they wanted him to come back to being his slave. So he was trying to sue for the right to not have to do that. But the Supreme Court determined that African Americans cannot sue in federal court whether or not they're freed or slave. So this kind of set the stage for all the racism that is going to ensue post-Civil War. An example of this is the St. Louis Reform Ordinance, which was in 1916 and not made illegal until 1948, which was the decision that you cannot buy a home in a neighborhood that is occupied 75% or more by a race other than your own. So if a neighborhood was in St. Louis is primarily white, a Black person is not eligible or was not eligible to buy a home in that, which led to the segregation that's still present in the city today. Another really important Supreme Court case that many people know about is Brown versus Board of Ed. This is a positive thing that happened in St. Louis. This led to the desegregation of schools. You can argue how desegregated are they really in terms of opportunity, but this definitely was a step in the right direction. And then that was interesting. I think it says that 73% of the St. Louis population, it's somewhere around there, is Black. But interestingly enough, that the city did not have a Black mayor until 1993. Another reason why you might have already known about segregation and systemic racism in St. Louis is because of the Ferguson case, which is a neighborhood in St. Louis, when Michael Brown, who was an 18-year-old black man, was shot by a 28-year-old white police officer while he was being arrested and killed. This was another rallying point of the Black Lives Matter movement, kind of similar to what has happened right now and been sparkulated after George Floyd's murder. And then most recently, this past weekend, there was a post, I saw it on social media, that a couple, very affluent couple, white couple in St. Louis came out of their mansion, and on the street outside of their mansion, there were many protesters for Black Lives Matter, and the husband, Mark McCloskey, comes out with an AR-15 and starts pointing it at all the protesters, and his wife, Patricia, also has a handgun, and they are just so against the protests being close to their house, and he shouldn't even be able to have access to a semi-automatic weapon in the first place. But anyways, this is just an example about how racism is still ever present in the city and our country. Moving on to the right, as I mentioned, St. Louis is an extremely segregated city. I've linked the report of Segregation in St. Louis, Dismantling the Divide, which looks at this segregation in all aspects of life, from poverty, education, healthcare access, job opportunities, all of the above. This specific graph is the present day African American population in St. Louis. So the top right with the green, that's where the African American population is centered. And then the bottom left is where the white population is, but pretty much all graphs depict the same thing. You can basically draw the line of segregation. And then in the middle, if you haven't seen the video already of Jamal, a black boy, and his cartoon character friend, this is a great explanation, 3 minutes long, examining systemic racism, and it's really educational, so I threw that in there. Moving on to the heart of my project, we have environmental racism, which is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. So this is ever present in St. Louis, part of which is because in that mostly black community, the interstates and the big highways run through their community and not the white community. So because of that, they're much more likely to be exposed to poor air quality and contract asthma, both of which are diseases and healthcare issues that can lead to premature death and heart attacks and reduced lung function. And the report that I linked under lead poisoning, examining environmental racism in St. Louis, said that blacks are 3 to 11 times more likely to encounter one of these issues than their white neighbors. Additionally, an interesting thing I noticed from the report was lead poisoning, which is a health impact that is like different. You don't think about it regularly, but there is a lot of lead poisoning cases in St. Louis, primarily because most of the houses there are still pretty old. So lead paint was used, among other things, and they have a lot of cases, as I said, in St. Louis, but black children make up 70% of the infected population and are 2.4 times more likely to be infected than white children, mostly in part to the fact that 4 out of the 5 hubs for this poisoning are in majority black neighborhoods. So as I said earlier, these instances of environmental racism are why black people's lungs aren't working in St. Louis and why they can't breathe. And then moving on to the I can't breathe version of George Floyd, I wanted to talk about police brutality because as you can see in the statistics in the bottom right corner, the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department is leading the country in the highest number of average annual rate of killings by police, being 17.9 per year examined between 2013 and 2018. And then just another example of systemic racism in the police force is that Black people make up 48.9% of the St. Louis population, but are 82.3% of the people that were killed by the police. So, as you can see, they're twice more likely to be killed by the police than white people, which is just another example of this racism that I've been talking about. Systemic racism and police brutality, that being violence, racism, and discrimination, are not anything new to this city. Basically, every few years, a white cop murders a Black man or woman, and the city attempts to rally and make reform, much like what's happening right now. Some really famous examples were in 2014, like I said, with Michael Brown, and then we have the Black Lives Matter protests right now. But basically, since the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, was formed in 1932, St. Louis has been trying to eradicate this systemic racism. Most recently, I thought this was a really interesting report, which is why I included it, was in 2011, the mayor conducted an equity score evaluation of the police department, and it only received a 53.4 out of 100, which is terrible. And basically, it was lacking equity in all areas except for promotions of white versus Black police officers. Those were pretty equal. But in terms of officer representation, it wasn't representative of the diversity of the community. Applicants also weren't representative. And then once applicants make it to the academy, Black applicants are 3 times more likely to be dismissed, and Black citizens are 2 times more likely to be stopped for traffic or municipal arrests, and most importantly, the use of force is 3 times more likely in Black neighborhoods. Overall, these two comparisons both make up systemic racism, and there are only 2 examples, but I wanted just to compare the 2. I thought they tied in really well to our class. I hope you guys have a great rest of your summer, and can't wait to watch some of your videos and see what you guys did to wrap up this class. Thank you.